Thank you very much, Krista. Hi, everybody. Kara Graves here with CTIA, and thank you so much for joining us for the first panel here at Mobile World Congress America's 5G Ready, a Spectrum Policy Update. We're going to be tackling a number of different issues today, focusing on the spectrum needs for getting all of that 5G connectivity that we've been hearing about for the last couple years, that we heard about at the keynote this morning, and looking forward to getting all of the guidance and expertise from this wonderful panel. So let me go ahead and introduce everybody. Directly to my left, we have Julie Knapp, who is the head of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the Federal Communications Commission. Next up, we have John Kuzin, who is Vice President and Regulatory Counsel at Qualcomm. Next to him, we have Kara Van Stralen, who is Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Senator Maggie Hassan. Next up, we have Chris Wieczorek, who is Director of Spectrum Policy at T-Mobile, followed by Grant Spellmeyer, Vice President of Federal Affairs and Public Policy at U.S. Cellular, and finally, Peter Tenhula, who has the longest title of anybody on the panel, so well done, Acting Deputy Associate Administrator for Spectrum Management at the Office of Spectrum Management at NTIA. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We appreciate it. I think just as a starting off point, we've all heard so much about 5G. I really just want to have really the industry folks set the table for us today. What is the vision of 5G? How has it evolved over the past couple years? We've obviously talked about this at the last 2 or 3 CTIA and Mobile World Congress shows. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what we can expect from 5G from the various companies here, what kind of trials we're looking at, and how the 5G vision has evolved over the last couple of years. So John, do you want to start?
Sure. So at Qualcomm, we've been working on 5G for a number of years. We're very excited by the potential for 5G. We were one of the main companies behind pushing acceleration of the standardization efforts. As many of you may know, in December, the 5G non-standalone 3GPP version was approved. That's last December, and just in June, the standalone version of 5G was approved as well. We've announced that we're going to have smartphones supporting 5G technology available in the first half of 2019, where there are a number of ongoing demos and pilots. And one of the things that I would just like to say as a table-setting point for 5G, everybody wants to be first. And as a manufacturer, supplier at Qualcomm is a close partner of the carriers, we too would like everyone to be first. But like 4G, the race to 5G is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So whoever is first is very important. But the more important thing is that over the next 5 to 7 years, we all continue to do what we've been doing. The FCC, NTIA, and the federal government have done an amazing job unleashing spectrum for 5G. That needs to continue. That is continuing, and looking forward to the future. We're at a very exciting time, and I'll just close with these opening remarks by just basically saying, next time when we're here in a year, there will be 5G, which is just remarkable. So I'm very excited.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
So at T-Mobile, we've been working on trying to be one of those first people out with 5G out there. Our claim to fame is we've been pointing out we've been having a great 600 megahertz deployment, which has been enabled by the federal government. About a year ago, the FCC held an auction for 600 megahertz that ended about a year ago. And we've been turning it on ever since. It's been a key linchpin in our spectrum deployment, and it's going to be our first real major 5G band in the United States to have a nationwide 5G footprint. So not local individual hotspots or municipalities, but you can get it in rural America in addition to the large cities. So that's a key thing from our perspective, and that's how we think America can help lead the race for 5G for everywhere, whether it's in New Hampshire or on New Hampshire Avenue in Washington, D.C. So we think that's really important for our perspective for 5G. The federal government's been a great partner in trying to make this happen, whether it's over at NTIA trying to make other spectrum available, either millimeter wave or mid-band, or the FCC most recently in the 600 megahertz auction. This cooperation between the government and the regulating entities and public and private entities is really important. So we think that's our key issue or key way to bring 5G to America, is to help everybody.
So, Kara, from U.S. Cellular's perspective, you had a number of interesting questions there in that lead-in. Let me try to address a couple of them. We're certainly actively looking at 5G deployments. We've had tests underway in 2016 and 2017 on 28 gigahertz, and I think there's a further standards-based test that's going to occur this year in one of our markets. We're actively looking at those deployments. You asked a question about why is it important. I think it's important because as I talked to a couple of folks last night, they were stressing the potential for this to be another, we know it's going to be big, but that it could actually be like an industrial revolution type development for our economy. And obviously that's going to change the lives of many people in many ways in many industries. And we at U.S. Cellular want to be part of that. But the second half of that is we want to make sure that we can get it to rural America as well. We're primarily a rural-focused carrier. Our spectrum policy revolves around, I think, two big availability and accessibility of that spectrum, not only to national carriers, but to regional providers and smaller companies, those that are focused in rural areas. And you'll hear me talk a little bit more about that through the course of the panel.
Great. Well, I think a key theme throughout that was that the federal government obviously does play a key role in making sure all of this does happen. And it sounds like industry is pretty satisfied with the efforts that the government has made so far. Good job, Julie. Good job, Pete.
Thank you.
But Peter, to get to you though, obviously the NTIA does play a key role in this. So I just want to get a sense from you, hearing the focus that industry has in trying to get this 5G deployed. How does that shape NTIA's policies in terms of making that availability happen?
Oh yeah, Kara, we have several roles, as you mentioned. My title is very long. I have actually 3 titles now, and I'm going to say them as I dodge answering your question, mainly because David Rettel, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Administrator, who has got a very long title as well, is going to be speaking in a couple hours on these very same topics, is going to get into a lot of details. I'm not going to preempt what he's going to say or repeat what he's going to say. But we'll focus on exactly what my role is, and our role, in the sense of I've taken on this associate administrator role because Paige Atkins recently retired. I'm also the deputy associate administrator and the chair of something called the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, which is an interagency committee made up of agencies. It's older than the FCC. It's been around since 1922. So that role relates to our role as a spectrum manager for the federal government, right? But at the same time, we're wearing this policy hat for the administration, and so we kind of get at loggerheads sometimes finding spectrum in the federal government coffer to provide access into the for the non-federal. For example, 5G, is that how you pronounce it? For whatever this, I can't spell it. So the way we do that is through cooperation and collaboration. And I know my youthful appearance doesn't look like it, but I've been actually doing this for about 30 years, a little less than Julie. But I've been through the 2Gs, 3Gs, and 4Gs too, starting out with implementing legislation going back to 1993, 97, and more recently 2012 with AWS-3. We got legislation in 2015 again. So we're driven by a lot, what Congress passes in these spectrum bills, and how we implement them is through as much collaboration as possible with industry, especially like we did with AWS-3. There's this Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, set up working groups that facilitated a lot of dialogue between the federal agencies and us. A lot of great lessons learned. We'd like to continue those and implement those forward because it's happening much quicker in many more bands and is becoming more and more and more and more and more complicated and harder. So wearing that hat, we want to make sure we get that collaboration set up. And that's kind of the the framework we want to use, so that the innovation in the industry, innovation that happens in the government, can be shared, information can be shared, and we can provide a pretty good customer for maybe you guys to serve, on the federal side, because they have needs that can't wait either, including higher speed data.
Absolutely. And it's great to see not only just industry and the other federal agencies involved, but obviously the FCC has been a huge facilitator of the 5G deployment. We hear Chairman Pai speak often about the need for 5G readiness. We, of course, have seen a number of not only spectrum policy rollouts, but also the infrastructure policies as well. So, thinking about that, the various, the collaborations, but also sort of the difficulties, as Peter mentioned, if it gets getting more complex, the more and more we dig in. How does that impact sort of how the FCC approaches these issues, and then also what can we see from the Commission, or what can we expect from the Commission moving forward on those piece parts?
How many questions?
It was a lot. I do a lot. I'm sorry. Well, it gives you options though on what you want to answer. So,
Just struck by, for us to be successful on next generation wireless, it really is a collaborative effort. We all have roles. It's obviously not just what the FCC or NTIA or we in government, Congress, the executive branch all do pulling to make this happen, but all the great work that goes on with the stakeholders, the incumbents, and trying to work through questions like sharing and how can they be protected, and industry developing the innovation and technology. So clearly we have a big role to play in making spectrum available. I'll try to not get too far into the weeds, but just to recap quickly, you've heard some of these things mentioned before. So the TV incentive auction, I think, was a resounding success. You're already hearing about services that are being rolled out there and with pathways to 5G. When it comes to mid-band, there's actually kind of three pieces to it. There's the one that we've already got in the pretty close to getting out there in the citizen broadband radio service. Yeah, we really wrestled over whether to call it citizens band. But anyway, so that's pretty far along, and we started proceeding to look at the spectrum just above it at 3,700 to 4,200, and we've got some potential pathways there. The NTIA and the DoD have agreed to study the spectrum that's just below it. So, we've got spectrum already in the hopper and more that's being looked at, I think, and things are looking promising. And then when it comes to the so-called high band, the spectrum that many of us said through our careers was never going to be useful for mobile. We've opened up the bands, the shorthand we've used, been 28 gigahertz, 37, 39, 24, which, yeah, exactly, sounds like football play. But there's huge swaths of spectrum that have been opened up, and I think one of the things sometimes that gets missed is, we've announced auctions, which is terrific, but we had also given the incumbent licensees in many cases the flexibility to convert their existing licenses for mobile use. So it's not as though this can't happen until after the auction. We've got people who are already planning to roll out services. And then just for good measure, we also started proceeding a proposal above 95 gigahertz. Thinking back, said, gee, we never thought, spectrum above 6 gigahertz was good for mobile. Maybe part of the lesson from that is the technology may not be ready today for mobile. We're not holding this out as the answer. But, when we open up spectrum, we often find that the technology follows and drives, and it may take some time, but so we're doing everything we can to open up the spectrum. The other thing I think that is interesting here, having been at the Commission for a long time, and Peter can vouch, we used to do the allocation proceeding. That would take time, and then we'd do the service rules, and then we'd figure out the auction. We kind of did everything as one big action. So all of the pieces are there. We have a little bit more to do, and maybe I'll address that later on, but we feel pretty good about how we're moving. It doesn't mean that we're going to rest on anything. We're going full speed ahead on everything we still got out there.
sounds like you're trying to keep yourself busy.
All of you, too.
There you go. There you go. All the attorneys out there as well. So I did want to make sure to touch on some of what we're hearing on the Hill as well. Kara, your boss has been actively involved in trying to help close the digital divide, but also try to promote 5G services through the Airwaves Act. So tell me a little bit about how your boss views the importance of 5G and how will Airwaves help?
Definitely. So the Airwaves Act is a bill that Senator Hassan was fortunate enough to partner with Senator Gardner on. It is truly a bipartisan effort. Every meeting we've had, everything, has been just really collaborative. And it sets a roadmap for the federal government to make spectrum available, both licensed and unlicensed, across the board. And it does set some pretty aggressive timelines for that, but we find sometimes you have to start here so that if this ever moves forward, maybe it'll land here or here. But the bill also makes meaningful investments in rural broadband by putting 10% of spectrum auction proceeds towards a rural broadband build-out program as well. So we're really excited about it. We have about 12 co-sponsors in the Senate and several in the House as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And by my math, if that 10% piece had been in place for the last 2 auctions, we would have seen about $6 billion going into investment in rural areas.
Right.
So, Grant, going to your point earlier, and U.S. Cellular being very involved and very dedicated to rural build-out, how would those types of provisions, whether it's Airwaves or Mobility Fund, how do those piece parts sort of work to help facilitate that rural build-out?
Well, I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle and to delivering 4G service to the areas that still don't have it in rural America, and then moving on to 5G. We love the Airwaves Act. Kudos to Senators Gardner and Hassan for introducing it. I'd love to get it passed and signed into law before we go off and do the next big tranche of auctions that we all know will come in 2019 and 2020, because if we could, for instance, get our hands on another $6 billion, that's bigger than what's in Mobility Fund 2. And that auction is going to take place at some point once we get the maps for that straightened out. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but there's a whole lot of issues with the maps at the FCC, and we're working to fix those. We think there's a need for well beyond the $5 billion that's in the current fund. We can take all that Julie can auction off over the next 5 years.
That's great. And Peter, I am going to put you on the spot, although I'm going to guess you're going to push me off on this one. But Airwaves does require identification of about 70 megahertz. Add that into the 30 megahertz for commercial use that we saw in the 2015 Budget Act, and that's a lot of valuable spectrum that could be out there for commercial use. What types of bands or what ranges do you think that we could be looking at there?
Well, sorry, Kara and Kara. to artfully dodge this one, I will just emphasize that, well, like I said, we've had 3 bills and laws passed in the last few years, 2012, 2015 with the Pipeline Act, 2018 with the Mobile Now Act. I think there's some overlap between Mobile Now and Airwaves as written. And our role, again, is helping Congress provide, technical assistance, where necessary, expertise, in shaping this. I personally like to see the reinvestment aspect of it, whether it's rural areas or Spectrum Relocation Fund, which is SRF, is one of the ways that, through the Pipeline Act and others, that we've taken auction proceeds and put it back into wireless, and innovation. So those kinds of those principal things. Another legislative concept that we're interested in, and that we put in, the NTIA put in its budget proposal last year, regards leasing. As another way of accessing spectrum that is currently used by the government or allocated to the government, federal government, for very important purposes. But may not be used everywhere, may not be used all the time. And instead of going through the normal, long, lengthy process, even when you mush the allocation and stuff together, is there a way to make it quicker and have a negotiated approach where spectrum access can be achieved through a leasing approach, as opposed to the whole identification, reallocation, technical studies that normally have to go on under the traditional approach. And maybe it's for, not necessarily these guys as carriers type applications, but more niche applications, special type of operations. So looking at those kinds of alternatives and ways to put the money back into and regenerate more and more of the bands, because that's exactly what but we don't even get our costs covered from the implementing 2012, 20 and those three other pieces of legislation. So there's lots of room in there for using those revenues. Which bands exactly get teed up? I could probably say which bands probably shouldn't be teed up, but I'm not going to talk about that now.
Fair enough. Well, a couple specific bands I did want to talk about is to segue a little bit into high band specifically. So we obviously know we've got the 28 gigahertz band starting up in auction here soon. We've got 24 shortly thereafter. Very excited to see the chairman announce that we're going to see 37, 39, and 47 next year as well. So from the industry perspective, I wanted to get some thoughts on the importance of high band spectrum specifically to 5G and what types of trials are out there on those specific bands and types of product availability that we might see there. So whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I think from T-Mobile's perspective, I can certainly say we're very excited and pleased that the FCC is working to get the 28 and the 24 auction. T-Mobile was very particular and interested in the 28 and 24 auction. In fact, we just had a file, I think, a filing at the FCC that the FCC came back very positive, encouraging us to participate in those auctions. So we're obviously looking forward to it. And we can't emphasize enough how important it is to get the more millimeter wave out there for there's more competition, more opportunities for consumers to benefit. I think T-Mobile we provided a very good example. When spectrum is made available to us, we put it to use. 600 megahertz is a great example. We got our licenses for that last June. We turned in on our first sites in July. A good example, Puerto Rico is a great example. The last TV station in Puerto Rico went off on September 1st of this year. We have over 110 sites now on the air, and with today's September 13th. The first sites went on about 24 to 48 hours after the last TV station went off the air. So when spectrum is made available, a lot of us carriers are willing to put it to use, whether it's, certainly T-Mobile, but other companies like Verizon, for instance, are doing a very good job rapidly deploying 28. So get that spectrum out there, we'll put it to use.
Great.
From Qualcomm's perspective, we're really excited about millimeter wave. Some of you may have heard last week we had a press release announcing the first successful data call using the 39 gigahertz band to a smartphone. It's actually this smartphone right here. So there's been questions about form factor and can you deploy millimeter wave inside of a cell phone? And I said earlier that there will be smartphones available in the second half of 2019. How do I know that? Well, here's a test device that can do it. And we've been working hard with our partners in the industry to make that happen. There are a number of devices in the pipeline that you're going to see. And what the FCC has done has been great, exactly what Julie said. When the FCC initially opened up 28 and 39, they said for the current licensees, LMDS in the 28 gigahertz band and the 39 gigahertz point-to-point, you can now deploy mobile. And a lot of that just spurred on a lot of innovation. And it wasn't too long ago where even ourselves in a parking lot on New Jersey location, we were rolling a rack of equipment and doing testing to try to check out the propagation. What signal reflections are you going to get? How are you going to make it work? And the fact that it's in a device this size is just remarkable. So we're ready, willing, and able to help everybody, deploy ASAP.
Who said all the device announcements are going to happen in Cupertino?
There you go. I like it.
Kara, from U.S. Cellular's perspective, high band is important. I can say that I think we're pleased with where 28 and 24 gigahertz came out in terms of the rules. I talked earlier about our two principles of availability and usability. I think in both of those bands, the FCC got it right. For instance, in 24, they created 7 100 megahertz blocks. That's important to a regional carrier as opposed to having it, done in some other configuration of 2 350 megahertz blocks or something like that. It guarantees us a shot at it. The second half of that, though, is the usability, things like interoperability. We've been very active urging the FCC to guarantee interoperability. They've done that again in 28 and 24, and one of the things we're watching in the remaining bands there, and frankly, when we get to mid-band, is interoperability there as well.
That's a great point.
Just add one point, because hopefully everybody in the room understands this, but I'll say it anyway. So often you'll hear people think, oh, 5G is millimeter wave. Actually, it can be in all of the spectrum we've talked about, and not lose sight of the fact that we've provided flexibility in all of the existing spectrum, which the industry can decide to transition at whatever pace it thinks is right. So you're going to see, I think, heterogeneous networks that use all of these different pieces to put together the best blends of coverage and capacity.
I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And it's part of why we always advocate for a mix of low, mid, and high band spectrum to facilitate all these uses. Julie, I actually want to stay with you for a second, because a big part of high band advocacy is trying to figure out how we're going to work with the various incumbents who are already in some of those high bands, whether it's satellite uses or whether it's federal government users, or it could be both. So just wanted to get a sense from you, and also Peter, how does that coordination happen? How do you balance the needs of the commercial industries versus protecting those mission critical services?
Yeah, I think, going back, people would look at different services and say, well, the only way this can share is we keep them apart geographically, or we have frequency coordination. You get these frequencies and you get those frequencies. But when you really start to dig down today, the nature of the technology enables sharing, not in every case, where all of the parties win. So that we provide for the incumbents room to grow, and it does not really encumber the new services that are deployed. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we get it right and that there's value. It's easy to say share, but at the end of the day, there has to be value for the new services to stimulate investment, that they know they're going to be able to deploy service in the areas that they are really interested in. And relative to the federal government, Peter and I and all of the folks working with Capitol Hill and the executive branch, spend a lot of time trying to figure out how can we squeeze more out of the same space that we have and still provide for the important services that the government needs. Think weather radars, especially now with all the storms. What are we all doing? We're looking at the radar pictures. Where is it going? Who's going to be hit and so forth? We need those. It can't be a choice of one or the other. We have to figure out ways that we can pack all of these things and meet all of these needs in the space that we've got.
Makes sense. Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it is a collaborative effort at all kinds of levels, among all kinds of parties. I mentioned the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, CSMAC, is a tool we used for AWS-3. For the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, the collaboration is happening in a little smaller scale group with cooperation the WIN Forum, Wireless Innovation Forum. And the players that are interested in that band, so it's a little different collaborative model there. We're not sure how we're going to do it in some of these millimeter wave bands. Like 37, lower 37 band, 37 gigahertz band is going to be an important sandbox for very innovative sharing opportunities, I think, among the federal and non-federal users. And the FCC has been very good about preserving that for those opportunities. Other bands that are being teed up in the millimeter wave, 42, very crucial aeronautical telemetry applications going on there, or that need to happen. The DoD has lost spectrum in other bands in that area, so they need to, figure out other ways to communicate with the planes that they're planning, and testing with, and other applications. So, what are the kind of, not just the spectrum kind of sharing approaches, but what kind of other partnerships that can be developed among the federal and the non-federal players here? And on the federal side, I mentioned the IRAC. We also have it's called a Policy Plan Steering Group, PPSG. That brings the White House and other folks into the mix. Office of Management and Budget, so that we have a kind of the lower level technical forums and the high level policy forums, interagency, to work these things out, and so that to avoid the conflicts, going forward. So it's a collaborative process. We see a lot of each other, at least, but so far it works out well. And I've been actually delving into the history of all this, and every so often they review this split kind of jurisdiction approach and why, the purpose of it, and back in the established quite many decades ago, and predictions of it's going to break down. This is in the 70s, and they tried to reformulate it back in the 78, 79 timeframe. Very interesting legislative history, by the way, of bills that did not get enacted.
Read up on it.
Anybody want to talk on the side, I'll be happy to.
There we go.
But it always gets questioned, always gets doubted, but it always works out. And it is, I think it's based on the leadership and the people that are there. I've been through many of these things. I mentioned AWS-3 would not have happened but for the leadership at NTIA and FCC and DoD. AWS-1 would not have happened. Same things. It's very important we keep that, and we keep that dialogue going on. And we have good people that help us through that.
Great. That's great. And you mentioned there as well the 3.5 band, which has a really interesting way of addressing some of that coordination with regard to not only involving the federal government, both of the agencies, but also the Wind Forum and the CBRS Alliance, and having those multi-stakeholder groups trying to develop that process. So sticking with that subject, the environmental sensing capability is actually one that has to get up and running for that 3.5 band. So I was curious if you had an update specifically to that initiative.
David will have an update on that
Okay.
in a couple hours, so come back at 3 o'clock and he will provide that update. It definitely is progressing. It's moving forward. A very innovative approach to sharing spectrum, not one that possibly could be applied, in other ways in the future. So hopefully, if we get this one right, we can see how we can apply it in other bands as well. Great.
And Kara and Julie, I'm sure you have people in your offices all the time talking about the importance of mid-band spectrum, the importance of getting the 3.5 band right. How does, Kara, to you, how does your boss sort of view the importance of mid-band and the importance of 3.5, and does Airwaves engage in that at all?
Yeah, definitely. The Airwaves Act does direct a potential auctioning of up to 500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum. We're hearing from industry all the time just how important it is, especially from the global harmonization perspective. So one way that Airwaves has been effective is it kind of provides, like I said, that additional roadmap and direction to the FCC, and so we're thrilled that they're moving ahead with their initiatives on mid-band, and we're kind of agnostic if it's legislation or if it's FCC action. We just want to see more spectrum in the hands of industry and innovators.
Great. And I know obviously the Commission's focused on this as well.
Yeah. There's really tremendous progress, I think, at 3.5. In fact, I'm going to speak with the CBRS Alliance shortly after this, and they've got more than 100 members with a diverse array of ideas and players across the industry about how to use this spectrum. Just a couple of comments, because I think we had some comments that were filed recently about the model that we used at 3.5. So it was the right tool for the set of circumstances that we had, and it also created the opportunity for us to put many pieces together: protection of incumbent systems, part of the spectrum licensed through auctions to provide certainty, part of the spectrum available with general authorized access similar to unlicensed, so everybody's got a shot. There were some questions about the channel sizes that we had. I think you're going to see a little bit more flexibility there. There were comments. Then you can put the channels together and so forth, and we didn't channelize the general access portion. But I think we understand this is, it was a solution for a set of circumstances. It may provide a solution in other cases, but we don't look for, let's take the tool and use it no matter what. But coming back to the value, what are the steps that we need to take? And I like to think of it as, let's try to find as simple a solution as possible that creates the value, the certainty for both the incumbents and the newcomers, and building the model that's right for the circumstances in front of us on any given band.
And what is that right model?
Well, I was going to go slightly different and put in a pitch on 3.7 to 4.2. To us at US Cellular, that's a very, very key band. And I know we're relatively early in the advocacy process on that, but for carriers looking to deploy 5G services in rural areas, the propagation characteristics there are going to be really good. There's a lot of talk about clearing, up to 500 megahertz of spectrum. I've heard chatter recently that the clearing target goals are industries. Some people within various industries are trying to drive that number down, that we might only see 150 or 100 megahertz of that cleared in the near term for mobile usage, and that's just a disaster from our perspective. The wireless industry needs to push hard for higher clearing targets. The other thing that I would mention that is of concern to us is there's discussions of moving to a private market sale mechanism that would depart from an auction like the FCC's done for the last 20 years. And we've got a lot of concerns about that as a smaller player trying to participate in a private sale mechanism. So you're going to hear us talk a lot about the need to go to a public auction like we have for a number of years.
Let's actually stick with C-band for a second. T-Mobile's perspective, what's the importance of getting the C-band out there for commercial use?
Well, I like it, as Grant pointed out, is like people saying up to 500 megahertz. Why not at least 500 megahertz? Let's get as much of that mid-band spectrum out there as possible. I think it's important to get it right as opposed to necessarily maybe the most quickest way, may not necessarily the best way.
Right.
And I think it's really critical that we get it done right. So if it needs to go ever so slightly slower, but to get more of it out there as opposed to just being a little sliver of spectrum that's made available over a very short period of time, I think it's really important that we get it done right. I think that's critical, because this is the possibility of a lot of spectrum being made available. And if we sell ourselves short, if we just say we're going to go for a small little piece what we can get, well, you create an isolated band plan that's not universally harmonized. It doesn't really get you a lot of spectrum, not a lot of utility out there. And so I think it's really important that you get you look at least 500 megahertz, not.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I'll move back to the 3.5 band. So the road to commercializing the 3.5 band has been a little longer than most of us would have liked. But like Julie said, we hopefully are in the home stretches. There's been applications filed for initial commercial deployments just within the past week. The FCC will hopefully, working with NTIA, review those and approve those. And, devices that support the band with Qualcomm's chipsets will be available, this year to support those deployments. So, we just encourage the FCC to do what it has been doing and move forward and let's finish the job. Since we're talking mid-band, in addition to the 3.7, I would also point out that Chairman Pai has announced his plan to move forward with an NPRM opening up the 6 gigahertz band, and this is precisely the 5.925 band, 5.925 up to 7.125, so it's really 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum. It's a hell of a lot of spectrum. And in there, we believe, as Julie has said, that the means of opening up that band needs to ensure that incumbents are protected. There are a lot of incumbent operations in that band, particularly point-to-point microwave links. And whatever service is deployed on an unlicensed basis will need to protect that. But the fact that the FCC is moving forward to explore that band, we think is extremely exciting for 5G NRSS spectrum sharing solutions, as well as the next generation of unlicensed 802.11ax.
Great. I have to ask Julie, when are we going to see it? When are we going to see 3.5 come?
I just heard this. So we just had the proposals from the SaaS providers for the initial commercial deployments. So we're going to take a look at those. I think they were very fulsome proposals, so we've got some work to do. We coordinated with NTIA and DoD in particular, so we're moving quickly there. The SaaSes are going through the testing at ITS Boulder. I think we've approved the first equipment. We've got more in the pipeline, so things are moving pretty fast. So I'm encouraged. I think we'll start seeing things relatively soon. And just to jump on what John mentioned about 6 gigahertz, we're working hard on that. So, we're expecting that we'll have something to put out before the chairman and commissioners to decide on pretty quickly. What am I missing? There's plenty of other things in the pipeline. So, for example, when we talked about some of these high bands, we still had some things we've got to settle. For example, on 37. And not everything results in the rulemaking is the next month. Sometimes it takes a fair amount of groundwork for us working with NTIA and DoD, and all of that is going on. In fact, just before I left, I had a meeting with the staff. And I don't know if folks are out there from the Wireless Bureau, but just want to give a shout out to them because they carry the lion's share of the load here, and we all work together really closely and well.
Fantastic. I want to stay with you for one more moment on 3450 to 3550, which you did mention earlier, and I'm sure Administrator Rutter will be speaking about here in a couple hours. But in terms of making sure that that band can be used in the most fulsome way it can if it is made available for commercial use, is the Commission taking any actions to help prevent against any encumbrances in that band, or sort of keeping an eye on any new applications there?
So we've had some folks raise questions recently. That band has been available for some non-federal deployments, and I think people have raised some questions about, well, if more goes in there, what's that going to mean? We'll certainly give it some thought. I think some of the concern is weather radars, and can you share, and the impact on that, and I think we'll just take a look at it.
Okay.
You want me to?
Please.
Yeah, the Mobile Now Act requires us to study 3100 to 3450, and 3550. We previously looked at the top 100 megahertz as kind of the target, but looking at the whole band, there are very important radar systems in that band, federal radar systems, of course, and so that's going to be collaborative. We also, I think, want to find out exactly, is this something that you can apply the 3.5 approach down band, or is it something that, what is the demand side of that, and how we're going to potentially work out, more and more innovative sharing approaches. And David may touch upon that and how that will be accomplished through using the spectrum, the proceeds from previous spectrum auctions, in the Spectrum Relocation Fund. The 3742 band, which is also mentioned, Mobile Now, which FCC has already put out. I look back at it seems like yesterday with the notice of inquiry went out, and the freakouts, boy, the freakouts. And you saw the language in the, maybe in why. No. Don't, just between us, the federal agencies were not happy with that, because it was just starting to be overwhelming, right? Especially with the international issues going on. I know we got another panel on that, where I hope to learn a lot tomorrow, I guess, right? Put a plug in for those guys who not only travel a lot, but have to deal with all these other countries, right? We have to deal with all these different agencies. So, this is, like I said, hard.
Absolutely. And a lot of nuance there, obviously. We're throwing around bands, we're throwing around all kinds of different terms here. But I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to, and I think we can all agree on this, is that we're really doing all of this and we're working through all of these weeds because we are trying to get these services into the hands of consumers throughout the country. So, Kara, I actually wanted to go to you then. I know this is a huge issue for your boss in terms of trying to help close that digital divide. So walk me through a little bit of what her priorities are there.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, we're all up here talking about how amazing 5G is going to be, but, you know, I've traveled through rural New Hampshire, West Virginia, all over the country, and some folks don't even have, you know, 3G services. Some people have no mobile service whatsoever where they live. So I think it's really important that we focus on this. I think that's one of the reasons why we put that investment in the Airwaves Act. And, you know, even on the fixed side, for example, I just talked to a constituent in New Hampshire who subscribes, their small business owner, they subscribe to 2 DSL lines in case one goes down in a storm or what, you know, the one's not working, then they have the other. And that's just not fair, I think, for people who live in one of the richest countries in the world. So this is a major focus for Senator Hassan, and we're committed to working with industry and public interest groups and folks on both sides of the aisle to address it.
Can we expect any more legislative efforts?
Yes. I don't know what they are yet, so send me your ideas. No. But I think we're definitely doing a lot of brainstorming now to lay the groundwork for next year and next Congress. So.
Great. Julie, anything else we can expect out of the commission? Not that you're not keeping your staff and Wireless Bureau staff busy enough, but...
No, we're done. That's a joke.
Wait, drop the mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, there you go.
No, there's plenty of work that I know sometimes we get asked, well, what's the priorities? I get told, you know, here's your priorities. There's 30 of them.
Yeah.
So, you know, the things we're working on, I think there's people are eager to see the decisions on 3.5, and I think you'll see that soon. You may hear more about it in the conference. We're working hard, I mentioned, on 6. We probably want to try to tackle a bit on the Spectrum Horizons piece. Behind the scenes, we've been working out some of the questions that we had on the remaining pieces of spectrum, so that's going on as well. So there's that, and put together a list of the things we had on our plate. I think it's about 50 or 60.
My goodness.
So, and that's just the policy rulemaking stuff. So, but you know, got great staff. I think great staff, you know, at NTIA, and we're all working together. So I'm absolutely confident things are going to keep moving.
Great, great. And just as some last thoughts, we only got a few minutes left, but from the industry perspective, why, similar to the question that I gave to Kara, why does all this matter? Why are we pushing so hard to make this happen?
I'll try to be as brief as I can, but if you look back to 2010 when 4G LTE was first rolling out, it's pretty remarkable what's happened in the last 8 years. We've integrated two IoT interfaces into LTE. Now, through carrier aggregation and approval of LTE unlicensed, we're actually seeing gigabit LTE services to a smartphone, and we're not even at 5G yet. So similarly, we're looking at 5G initial deployments being multi-gigabit per second service. But I think when you look out 5 to 10 years, the speeds and the level of service, the variability of devices that are going to be supported, I think will blow our minds. I mean, I couldn't tell you what is going to be out there, but I know it's, you know, the change is just increasing, and it's going to be remarkable.
And
Yeah,
for you guys.
I'm sorry, Chris. I talked at the start about an industrial revolution, and I really think that's what we're talking about here. Sure, the speed's going to be faster, but I don't think it's about the pipes and the airwaves that deliver the service. It's about the way it transforms medicine and education and training and work and factories and automobiles and flying cars and who knows what else. That's what's really going to be the lasting legacy of our efforts here as an industry, and folks like Julie and Peter.
Great. Chris, last word?
Yeah, I think one thing that shouldn't be overlooked, and it was a policy forum, is actually the help of Congress. One little known fact is it was a certain member, a staffer, and for the Energy and Commerce Committee, who's now the acting the administrator, who helped get the AWS-3 auction through the door. Because if folks remember back in 2012, 2013, it was a no. And it was a no, and it was a no, it can't be done, it can't be done, it can't be done. And then somebody said, let's have monthly meetings about this. And it turned into a yes. So I really see, I think, helping to get to all the wonderful, great things of 5G, I think Congress will have a very big role. Maybe not necessarily passing the legislation, but ensuring that things can actually turn from no's into yes.
I love it. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I hope you all enjoyed your time. And stick around, because clearly we need to be listening to what Administrator Rettle is going to be saying at 3 o'clock. So.
Clearly.
Thank you all very much.
Good job.
Nice job, John.
Take
Thank
care.
you.